last but not least, we come to just war, the just war tradition, just war theory. There's a variety of ways, but in its essentials, just war has a lot of things in common with the others, but just war is really saying that war is something that can be handled ethically. It can be justified. It is something to be avoided. And when you and there are certain conditions that a conflict that you deem as a war or a potential war have to meet such that you could say it is a just war. And and this is the important, is that it has a second component. Not only are there conditions that a war has to meet in order for it to be labeled as a just war, but when the combatants are involved in the war, there are rules that they follow as well. So in other words, it has to be just in order to be something you can legitimately fight. And when you're fighting it, there are certain ethical rules of the game that you must follow. So you could easily, in just war theory, right? You could say, well, I fought for the Allies, so I was fighting on the just side of the war. However, you can still commit war crimes if you do something on the battlefield, even though you're on the just side. You could do something to break the rules of war. So this is a more complex view. It still has war as kind of an instrumental approach to war, that war is an instrument. It's ultimately for the sake of something, achieving something, and you can justify using that tool of war for the exercise that you applied it to. So in that sense, war is not, in this framework, regarded as intrinsically bad or intrinsically good, but something that you try and avoid at all costs for moral reasons and economic ones as well, because war is so inherently destructive. But sometimes this view would say, very much like the militarist view, that sometimes in certain situations you could be obliged to go to war. So not only is the war justified, but it could be obligatory. Let's say if you were fighting against another power that was committing atrocities. So you could try and make an argument that you should invade or you should do something. And so that gets into all kinds of discussions of humanitarian military intervention, which some people would say, yes, that can be ethically justified. Now, I'm going to go into more of the real nuts and bolts. I just want to talk in this video about the historical aspects and sort of the general framework. So war, in this sense, is regarded as instrumental, but there is also, like in the militaristic view, there is an ideology behind it. Now, recall, with the militarists, it was war is a total adversarial relationship, and that's not really the same for just war. So if you look in the history of just war, and it has a long, rich, and thick tradition in the West, you find it also in a variety of other traditions. And by the West, I largely just simply mean European thought and some American thought. But in a lot of, like in Islamic culture, there's a huge just war tradition there. There's one in Chinese thought, Japanese thought, Indian thought. And a lot of the principles, interestingly enough, they might be stated in slightly different ways. They might be organized in different patterns, but they tend to have that main distinction that I talked about, is the real ethical commander makes two decisions. One, whether or not it's a good idea to go, it's an ethical good idea, all things considered, to go into war, and when you're in it, how to fight it. Now, the second one comes in history a lot later. So the first one, the general framework, comes early in history. It comes out of antiquity. And so you'll find these basic ideas of when it is justified to go to war. You can find this back in ancient Greece. You can find it in St. Augustine as well. St. Augustine is sometimes called the father of just war theory. That's probably not quite accurate. But what I just want to mention is one of the ancient Roman thinker, Cicero. And Cicero, in many ways, you can think of, said some pretty fundamental, laid down the foundations for what we would call the just war tradition, and that was largely picked up by Augustine and the like. And in Cicero, he holds that humanity forms a kind of collectivity. This is pretty advanced thinking for an ancient Roman, but nonetheless, for Cicero, he thinks and he's in the Roman tradition of declaring war, which was full of pomp and circumstance, and you had to do all kinds of things before you could legitimately even declare war. You had to warn your enemy, and they got 30 days, and all these things to respond. And also, there was an idea in Roman war that that Rome was the corporeal, or the earthly image of Jupiter. So it was bound up with its metaphysics of framework, which we would sometimes today, oh, they had a concept of a holy war. Yes, they did. All right. Now, I just want to talk a little bit now about Cicero. So for Cicero here, great Roman orator, we're about 106 to 43 BC. And so he wrote a number of books in defense of the Republic, on the gods, etc., books on skepticism that were very influential on early Christian thinkers, Augustine, as I mentioned. But in this sense of reflections on war, he's also an important part of our tradition. And in philosophy, we don't often study Cicero because he wasn't really that original, right? And so we tend to sort of lay emphasis on people that were original. But Cicero was a great synthesizer. He put a lot of ideas together in a nice packaged format, and others could draw inspiration from them. And Cicero had some interesting reflections. War has an instrumental dimension to it, that a war is essentially for the purpose of peace, right? That you fight wars, right, to end wars and to end conflict. So conflict is a self-defeating notion. That's the good of conflict, is when it defeats itself. And he does say very clearly, and this is an early notion of, we judge nations and groups. We judge those on why and how they entered warfare. So why they went to fight and how they fought. Wars have to be formally announced. It's not, you don't just surprise, or that's an ambush. That's not a war, right? Wars have to be formally declared, and they have to be fought by legal, oath-bound people. So it's not like a big mob. That's not a war, right? So to go and just get just a random group of people fighting a random group of people, that's not a war. Wars are basically, as we saw earlier in the earlier videos, that it has a political dimension. So it has an organization to it. Justice, right? The ancients were always talking about justice. That's one of the fundamental questions of Plato's Republic. What is justice? Aristotle talks about justice right smack in the middle of the Nicomachean Ethics, and anchors much of the discussion of virtue ethics around the concept of justice. Cicero says, justice must be shown, must always be shown. Your enemies from the highest to the lowest. If you make agreements, you make pacts with other groups of people, you honor them. And injustice can be done through force or deceit. And in that sense, there is a sense of honor in behavior. And for Cicero, he thought there was a deep connection, right? A deep connection that is a deep fellowship in the human race, that we are all ultimately of one kind of large sort of extended family in a way. And so he often thought that, again, typical of sort of imperialist ventures, that they were bringing enlightenment, that they were bringing better things, roads and aqueducts and all that stuff. other people. So, but it was to, and also some of the ideals of the Roman Empire. It was to make these quote unquote barbarian types into Romans, right? To educate them and make their societies better. But at the end of it all, when you do all this, it's supposed to be done according to rules. So it's not just out this haphazard sort of attacking everything that goes. And you would be formally announcing this. I mean, yes, it's imperialism dressed up, and that's often been a criticism of just war theory. It's just a form of imperialism or rationalization. You know, you want to go to war, so go and look up the just war tenets and see how you can sort of rig up an argument to get the answer that you want. Sure, that's been done a lot, but just because it's been done, that doesn't mean that the whole theory is trash. Many theories can be exploited. Humans exploit all kinds of things, and the fact that humans exploit something doesn't necessarily make that something intrinsically wrong. So just war theory was an attempt to try and hold the notion of conquering at bay, but whether it always did, sadly, no, it didn't. Any case, so he is an old Stoic, right? That the fight, the struggle is on the behalf of fairness, bringing justice, the spread of justice. And the Great Spirit is part of this, is one who's part of this endeavor. And the object also of conflict and violence is the spread of law, right? Spread of law and justice. And what does the spread of law and justice do? It increases the depth of these bonds of fellowship that we have. So there you go. There he lays the groundwork. Augustine comes along and builds all this up. He adds a Christian dimension to it. And we could go on for hours with the history of this, because the just war theory really starts off at the beginning largely with its first proposition, namely of, first question, when is it justified to go to war? So that dominates the tradition for quite a few centuries, up until, around the 1500s, until the second part comes in, how exactly do you fight the war? But we saw Cicero adumbrates all this back in antiquity, where he says, you're judged by why you go and how you fight. So the why you go and how you fight, it's the why you go that people talk about for the first several centuries of the tradition, and then the how you fight comes in later. It's like a historical add-on. Sometimes the how you fight was even, bound up in the why you're going to war as well. Today, in modern discussions of just war theory, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not, you can have a real split between why you go to war and how you fight it. Historically, the two were often combined. One, the how you fight was largely somewhat ignored, and the why you fight was most important. Today, those two have been pulled apart, analyzed, and the fight is how they're to be integrated or not. And so that's a discussion for another time. But the basic idea of just war is, again, war is an instrument. It can produce a good, doesn't necessarily. It's to be avoided at all costs, but there are conditions under which you can argue that something meets it. And it's all predicated on this underlying common humanity element that Cicero is, that your enemy is not a pure enemy, not a pure foe, but it's an opponent, yes, but not a radical adversary or a radical other. Now, we're going to look in later videos at a little bit more of the technical formulation of just war, because that's going to form the backbone of our analyses when we start talking more about artificial intelligence and warfare as well.